The 747 took off from Haneda International Airport like any other flight. This evening's flight was headed toward Osaka in the midst of the Obon holiday period, with many passengers excitedly heading home to see their families or go on vacation. Takeoff was routine, and the climb into the sky was going exactly as planned. The flight had almost reached cruising altitude when suddenly, the cabin shuddered violently with a loud bang. Passengers and crew instantly were alarmed, and the next 30 minutes would not only be excruciatingly terrifying, but the last 30 minutes of their lives for many of them. Japan Airlines Flight 123 is the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history, and the deadliest aviation incident in Japan. A seemingly normal flight quickly descended into chaos, ending in a fiery crash. But why? The aircraft in question, JA8119, was a Boeing 747 SR-46 built and delivered to Japan Airlines in 1974. It had accumulated slightly more than 25,000 flight hours and 18,800 cycles, one cycle consisting of takeoff, cabin pressurization, depressurization, and landing. The aircraft did experience one prior incident before the crash on June 2, 1978. While operating Japan Airlines Flight 115, the plane bounced heavily on landing while carrying out an instrument approach to runway 32L at Osaka Itami Airport. The pilot then excessively flared the aircraft, causing a massive tail strike on the second touchdown. Of the 394 on board, 25 were injured, with 2 of these injuries being critical. The tail strike cracked open the aft pressure bulkhead, and this damage was later repaired by Boeing technicians. The aircraft would return to service after this. Keep this in mind, it's important for later. For her flight crew, JA8119 was serviced by 15 crew members, which consisted of 3 cockpit crew and 12 cabin crew. In the cockpit was Captain Masami Takahama, 49, serving as a training instructor for the first officer on the flight, who was training to become a captain, supervising him while handling the radio communications, and also acting as first officer. Takahama was a veteran pilot, having logged about 12,424 flight hours, including about 4,842 flight hours in Boeing 747s. Next, we have First Officer Tutaka Sasaki, 39, who was undergoing training for promotion to captain as I mentioned earlier. Flight 123 was to be one of his final training and evaluation flights acting as captain. He had logged about 3,963 flight hours, including around 2,665 hours in 747s. And finally, we have Hiroshi Fukuda, 46, a veteran flight engineer having logged about 9,831 flight hours, roughly 3,846 of those hours in 747s. The flight was during the Obon holiday period when many Japanese people make their trips to their hometowns or to resorts. Of the 509 passengers aboard, only 22 were non-Japanese, which included 4 residents of Hong Kong, 2 from Italy, 1 from the UK, 1 from West Germany, and 6 from the US. The aircraft landed as JL-366 at Haneda Airport in Ota, Tokyo, Japan, from Fukuoka Airport at 5:12 p.m. on August 12, 1985. After nearly an hour on the ground, Flight 123 pushed back from Gate 18 at 6:04 p.m. and took off from runway 15L at 6:12 p.m., 12 minutes behind schedule. 12 minutes after takeoff at 6:24 p.m., near cruising altitude over Sagami Bay, the aircraft underwent explosive decompression, bringing the ceiling down near the lavatories, damaging the unpressurized fuselage aft of the plane, unseating the vertical stabilizer, and severing all 4 hydraulic lines. Remember that tail strike from 1978? This is where it comes in, right at that aft bulkhead. Explosive decompression is a form of uncontrolled decompression, which is an undesired drop in the pressure of a sealed system, such as a pressurized aircraft cabin, that typically results from human error, structural failure, or impact, causing the pressurized vessel to vent into its surroundings or to fail to pressurize at all. In this case, it vented rather explosively. Immediately, the pilots set their transponder to broadcast a distress signal. Captain Takahama contacted Tokyo Area Control Center to declare an emergency and request a return to Haneda Airport, descending and following emergency landing vectors to Oshima. Tokyo Control approved a right-hand turn to a heading of 90 degrees back toward Oshima, and the aircraft entered an initial right-hand bank of 40 degrees, several degrees greater than observed previously. Captain Takahama ordered First Officer Sasaki to reduce the bank angle and expressed confusion when the aircraft did not respond to the control wheel being turned left. The flight engineer reported hydraulic pressure was dropping. The captain repeated the order to reduce the bank angle as the autopilot had disengaged. He ordered the first officer to bank it back, then ordered him to pull up. None of these attempted maneuvers elicited a response. The pilots realized the aircraft had become virtually uncontrollable, and Captain Takahama ordered the co-pilot to descend. The situation was going from bad to worse. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comment section below. Alright folks, it's time to get into the final descent. The aircraft was heading over the Izu Peninsula at 6:26 p.m. when it turned away from the Pacific Ocean and back toward the shore, but only turned right far enough to fly a northwesterly course. Seeing that the aircraft was still flying west away from Haneda, Tokyo Control contacted the aircraft once more. After confirming the pilots were declaring an emergency, the controller asked the nature of the emergency. At this point, hypoxia appeared to have begun setting in, as the pilots did not respond. Also, the captain and co-pilot asked the flight engineer repeatedly if hydraulic pressure had been lost, seemingly unable to comprehend it. Tokyo Control contacted the aircraft again, and repeated the direction to descend and turn to a 90-degree heading to Oshima. Only then did the captain report that the aircraft was uncontrollable. The conversation went as follows in English. Tokyo. Japan Air 123, fly heading 90, radar vector to Oshima. JAL 123, but on uncontrol. Tokyo. Uncontrol. Roger. Understood. The aircraft traversed Suruga Bay and passed over Yaizu Shizuoka at 6:31:02 p.m. Tokyo Control asked the aircraft if they could descend, and Captain Takahama replied that they were currently descending, stating their altitude was 24,000 feet. Captain Takahama declined Tokyo Control's suggestion to divert to Nagoya Airport 72 nautical miles away, instead preferring to land at Haneda, which had the facilities to handle a 747. The flight data recorder shows that the flight did not descend, but was rising and falling uncontrollably. With the total loss of hydraulic control and non-functional control surfaces, the plane entered phygoid oscillations lasting about 90 seconds, which is a state where airspeed decreases as the aircraft climbs and increases as it falls. The rise in airspeed increased the lift over the wings, resulting in the aircraft climbing and slowing down, then descending and gaining speed over and over. Almost immediately after the separation of the stabilizer and rudder removed the only means of damping yaw, which is rotation around the yaw axis, the aircraft began to exhibit Dutch roll, simultaneously yawing right and banking left, before yawing back left and banking right. At some points, the banking motion became very profound, with large arcs of around 50 degrees in cycles of 12 seconds. Despite the complete loss of control, the pilots continued to turn the control wheel, pull on the control column, and move the rudder pedals up until the moment of the crash. The pilots also began efforts to establish control using differential engine thrust, as the aircraft slowly wandered back toward Haneda. Their efforts had limited success. The unpressurized aircraft rose and fell in an altitude range of 20,000 to 25,000 feet for 18 long, agonizing minutes, from the moment of the decompression until around 6:40 p.m., with the pilots seemingly unable to figure out how to descend without flight controls. This was possibly due to the effects of hypoxia at such altitudes, as the pilots seemed to have difficulty comprehending their situation as the aircraft pitched and rolled uncontrollably. Hypoxia is a condition in which the body's tissues do not receive enough oxygen. It can occur when there is a decrease in the amount of oxygen in the air, blood, or tissues. The pilots possibly were focused instead on the cause of the explosion that they heard, and the subsequent difficulty in controlling the jet. The flight engineer did say they should put on their oxygen masks when word reached the cockpit that rearmost passenger masks had stopped working. None of the pilots put on their own oxygen masks, however, though the captain simply replied yes to both suggestions by the flight engineer to do so. The accident report indicates that the captain's disregard of the suggestion is one of several features, quote, regarded as hypoxia-related in the CVR recording. Their voices can be heard relatively clear on the cockpit area microphone for the entire duration, until the crash. indicating that they did not put on their oxygen masks at any point during the flight. At 6:35 p.m., the flight engineer responded for the first time to multiple calls from Japan Air Tokyo via the cell call or selective calling system. Having just been informed about the inoperable oxygen masks, the flight engineer voiced the erroneous assumption that the R5 door was broken and informed the company that they were making an emergency descent. Japan Air Tokyo asked if they intended to return to Haneda, to which the flight engineer responded that they were making an emergency descent and to continue to monitor them. Eventually, the pilots regained limited control of the aircraft by adjusting engine thrust. In doing so, they dampened the phugoid cycle and somewhat stabilized their altitude. However, given the jet engine's inertia and the resulting response time to changes in throttle, quote, suppressing of Dutch roll mode by use of the differential thrust between the right and left engines is estimated practically impossible for a pilot. Shortly after 6:40 p.m., they lowered the landing gear using the emergency extension system in an attempt to dampen the phugoid cycles and Dutch rolls further. This was somewhat successful as the phugoid cycles were dampened almost immediately and the Dutch roll was significantly dampened, but lowering the gear also decreased the directional control the pilots were getting by applying power to one side of the aircraft, and the aircrew's ability to control the aircraft quickly deteriorated. Shortly after lowering the gear, the flight engineer asked if the speed brakes should be used, but the pilots did not acknowledge the request. The aircraft then began a right-hand descending 420-degree turn from a heading of 40 degrees at 6:40 p.m. to a heading of 100 degrees at 6:45 p.m., flying in a loop over Otsuki, due to a thrust imbalance created from having the power setting on engine 1, the leftmost engine, higher than the other three engines. The aircraft also began descending from 22,400 feet to 17,000 feet, as the pilots had reduced engine thrust to near idle from 6:43 to 6:48 p.m. Upon descending to 13,500 feet at 6:46 p.m., the pilots again reported an uncontrollable aircraft. At this time, the aircraft began to slowly bank to the left, while continuing to descend. The thicker air allowed the pilots more oxygen, and the hypoxia appeared to have subsided somewhat, as they were communicating more frequently. The pilots also appeared to be understanding how grave their situation had become, with Captain Takahama exclaiming, quote, "This may be hopeless," at 6:46:33 p.m. At 6:47 p.m., the pilots recognized that they were beginning to turn toward the mountains. Despite efforts by the crew to get the aircraft to continue to turn right, it instead turned left, flying directly toward the mountainous terrain on a westerly heading. As the aircraft continued west, it descended below 7,000 feet and was getting dangerously close to the mountains. Because of the thicker air at lower altitude, the cabin altitude alert momentarily turned off at this time, before resuming for the rest of the flight. The captain briefly ordered maximum engine power to attempt to get the aircraft to climb to avoid the mountains, and engine power was added abruptly at 6:48 p.m. before being reduced back to near idle. Then at 6:49 p.m. it was ordered raised again. This greatly excited the phugoid motion, and the aircraft pitched up, before pitching back down after power was reduced. When power was added again, the aircraft rapidly pitched up to 40 degrees, and the airspeed dropped to 108 knots at 6:49:30 p.m., briefly stalling at 9,000 feet. The captain immediately ordered maximum power at 6:49:40 p.m. as the stick shaker sounded. A stick shaker is a mechanical device designed to rapidly and noisily vibrate the control yoke of an aircraft, warning the flight crew that an imminent aerodynamic stall has been detected. The aircraft's airspeed increased as it was brought into an unsteady climb. Possibly in order to prevent another stall, at 6:51 p.m., the captain lowered the flaps to 5 units, due to the lack of hydraulics, using an alternate electrical system, in an additional attempt to exert control over the stricken jet. It took 3 minutes and 10 seconds for the trailing edge flaps to reach 5 units. The leading edge flaps, except for the left and outer groups, were also extended, and the extension was completed at 6:52:39 p.m. From 6:49:03 to 6:52:11 p.m., Japan Air Tokyo attempted to call the aircraft again via the cell call radio system. During the entire period, the cell call alarm continued to ring, to which the pilots did not react. The aircraft reached 13,000 feet at 6:53 p.m. when the captain reported an uncontrollable aircraft for the third time. Shortly afterward, the controller asked the crew to switch the radio frequency to 119.7 for Tokyo approach. Although the pilots did not acknowledge the request over the radio, they did switch frequencies as instructed. Tokyo approach then contacted the flight via the cell call system, briefly activating the corresponding alarm again until the flight engineer responded. At this point, the flight crew requested to be given their position, which at 6:45 p.m. was reported to the flight as 45 nautical miles northwest of Haneda and 25 nautical miles west of Kumagaya. At 6:55 p.m., the captain requested flap extension and the co-pilot called out a flap extension to 10 units, but the flaps had already extended past 5 units at 6:45:30 p.m. and had reached 20 units 1 minute and 2 seconds later. Meanwhile, the aircraft had started banking abnormally toward the right. This was most likely due to an imbalance in the lift generated by the left and right flaps. Power was increased at the same time. While the flaps continued to extend, a differential thrust setting caused engine power on the left side to be slightly higher than on the right side, adding to the roll on the right. 1 minute later, the flaps were extended to about 25 units. The bank angle exceeded 60 degrees and the nose began to drop. Captain Takahama immediately ordered the flaps to be retracted and the power was added abruptly, but still with higher power settings on the left engines than on the right. The asymmetric thrust settings continued to increase as the bank angle continued to exceed 80 degrees. The captain was heard on the CVR desperately requesting for the flaps to be retracted and for more power to be applied in a last-ditch effort to raise the nose. The aircraft continued an unrecoverable right-hand descent toward the mountains as the bank angle recovered to about 70 degrees, and engines were pushed to full power, during which the ground proximity warning system sounded. In the final moments, as the airspeed exceeded 340 knots, the pitch attitude leveled out and the aircraft ceased descending, with the aircraft and passengers and crew being subjected to 3g of upward vertical acceleration. G-forces, or gravitational force equivalent, is a mass-specified force, expressed in units of standard gravity. The aircraft was still in a 40-degree right-hand bank when the right wing clipped a ridge containing a U-shaped ditch, 1,710 feet west-northwest of the previous ridge at an elevation of 5,280 feet. It is speculated that this impact separated the outer third of the right wing and 2 engines, which were, quote, dispersed 1,600 to 2,300 feet ahead. After this impact, the aircraft flipped on its back, struck another ridge 1,870 feet northwest from the second ridge near Mount Takamagahara, and exploded. The impact registered on a seismometer located in the Shin-Etsu Earthquake Observatory at Tokyo University from 6:56:27 p.m. as a small shock to 6:56:32 p.m. as a larger shock, believed to have been caused by the final crash. The shock waves took an estimated 2 to 2.3 seconds to reach the seismometer, making the estimated time of the final crash 6:56:30 p.m. Thus, 32 minutes had elapsed from the bulkhead failure to the crash. The aircraft crashed at an elevation of 5,135 feet in Sector 76, State Forest 3577 Azahantani, Uwaza Narahara, Ueno Village, Tano District, Gunma Prefecture. The east-west ridge is about 8,200 feet north-northwest of Mount Mikuni. Ed Magnuson of Time magazine said that the area where the aircraft crashed was referred to as the, quote, Tibet of Gunma Prefecture. The next step was a rescue operation, and it would come too late. If you like history and disasters, make sure to check out my other channel, Shipwreck Sunday. I post there every Friday and Sunday at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Okay, let's look at the rescue operation and why the response was so delayed. A United States Air Force navigator stationed at Yokota Air Base published an account in 1995, stating that the U.S. military had monitored the distress calls and prepared a search and rescue operation that was aborted at the call of Japanese authorities. A U.S. Air Force C-130 crew was the first to spot the crash site 20 minutes after impact, while it was still daylight, and radioed the location to the Japanese and Yokota Air Base, where an Iroquois helicopter was dispatched. An article in the Pacific Stars and Stripes from 1985 stated that personnel at Yokota were on standby to help with rescue operations, but were never called by the Japanese government. A JSDF helicopter later spotted the wreck after nightfall. Poor visibility and the difficult mountainous terrain prevented it from landing at the site. The pilot reported from the air no signs of survivors. Based upon this report, JSDF personnel on the ground did not set out to the site on the night of the crash. Instead, they were dispatched to spend the night at a makeshift village, erecting tents, constructing helicopter landing ramps, and engaging in other preparations, 39 miles from the crash site. Rescue teams set out for the site the next morning. Medical staff later found bodies with injuries suggesting that people had survived the initial crash only to die from shock, exposure to low temperatures overnight in the mountains, or injuries that, if tended to earlier, would not have been fatal. One doctor was quoted as saying, quote, "If the discovery had come 10 hours earlier, we could have found more survivors." The 4 survivors that were found, all of them female, were seated on the left side and toward the middles of seat rows 54 through 60 in the rear of the aircraft. They were Yumi Ochai, a Japan Airlines off-duty flight purser, Hiroko and Mikiko Yoshizaki, a mother and her 8-year-old daughter, who both sadly lost their loved ones in the crash, and Keiko Kawakami, a 12-year-old girl who also lost her parents and sister in the crash. Yumi Ochai recounted from her hospital bed that she saw bright lights and heard the sound of helicopter rotors shortly after she awoke amid the wreckage, and while she could hear screaming and moaning from other survivors, these sounds gradually died away during the night. All 15 crew were killed, as well as 505 of the 509 passengers on board. In 1987, following the investigation, all 3 cockpit crew members would be posthumously awarded the Polaris Award. Let us take a moment to remember all of the victims who perished in the crash of Japan Airlines Flight 123. May they rest in peace. But what caused this? Japan's Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission published their final report on the accident on June 19, 1987. The official cause of the crash, according to the investigation, was: firstly, the tail strike incident at Osaka International Airport 7 years earlier as JAL Flight 115, which damaged the aircraft's aft pressure bulkhead. And secondly, and most importantly, the subsequent repair of the bulkhead did not conform to Boeing's approved repair methods. For reinforcing a damaged bulkhead, Boeing's repair procedure calls for 1 continuous splice plate with 3 rows of rivets. The Boeing repair technicians, however, had used 2 splice plates parallel to the stress crack. Cutting the plate in this manner negated the effectiveness of the row of rivets, reducing the part's resistance to fatigue cracking to about 70% of that for correct repair. The post-repair inspection by JAL did not discover the defect as it was covered by overlapped plates. During the investigation, the Accident Investigation Commission calculated that this incorrect installation would fail after about 11,000 pressurization cycles. The aircraft accomplished 12,318 successful flights from the time that the faulty repair was made to when the crash happened. So, after repeated pressurization cycles during normal flight, the bulkhead gradually started to crack near the row of rivets holding it together. When it finally failed, the resulting rapid decompression ruptured the lines of all 4 hydraulic systems and ejected the vertical stabilizer. With many of the aircraft's flight controls disabled, the aircraft became uncontrollable. Due to the structural failure and the human error in the repairs, 520 people lost their lives. Rest in peace to all of the victims of Flight 123.